Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Quotes: Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Ludwig Wittgenstein is a seminal work that presents a meticulous exploration of language, logic, and the boundaries of human thought. This complex text, organized into a series of propositions and sub-propositions, delves into Wittgenstein's theory of logical atomism, asserting that the structure of language mirrors the structure of reality. By distinguishing what can be said from what must remain unsaid, Wittgenstein investigates the nature of truth, the limits of language, and the role of logic in understanding the world. Each proposition in this compact and structured work builds toward a profound philosophical argument that challenges traditional notions of meaning and knowledge, encouraging readers to contemplate the relationship between language, thought, and reality. Quote 1. The world is all that is the case. This is the opening statement of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, emphasizing the concept that reality consists of everything that exists or occurs, only facts, not the objects themselves. In this context, the case refers to facts, or states of affairs, which make up the world as we experience and understand it. Wittgenstein is establishing that the world is defined not by physical objects alone, but by the relationships and facts concerning these objects. Quote 2. The world is the totality of facts, not of things. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the world is made up of facts, truths about objects and their relations, not the physical things themselves. The distinction highlights that the way we perceive and structure the world is through understanding connections between facts rather than merely categorizing objects. These facts form the basis of our comprehension of reality, shaping how we engage with it. Quote 3. The world is determined by the facts, and by their being all the facts. Here, Wittgenstein is suggesting that the entirety of what exists is determined by facts, and not just any collection of facts, but by every fact that could possibly exist. The world, in this philosophical sense, is fully dependent on facts that describe what is true and what is not. In this system, there is no room for things outside these facts, and the world is as complete as the facts themselves. Quote 4. For the totality of facts determines what is the case, and also whatever is not the case. Wittgenstein stresses that it is the sum of all facts that defines both what exists and what does not. The logical space created by facts doesn't just tell us what is true, it also tells us what cannot be true. This duality of determining both possibilities and impossibilities defines the limits and structure of reality. Quote 5. Each item can be the case or not the case, while everything else remains the same. This statement points to the independence of facts from each other. Wittgenstein is explaining that a single fact can change without affecting the rest of reality, meaning that facts are independent entities that coexist within the broader framework of the world. This notion introduces the idea that the structure of the world remains intact, even as individual facts may shift. Quote 6. What is the case, a fact, is the existence of states of affairs. Wittgenstein begins Chapter 2 by explaining that facts are nothing more than the existence of certain states of affairs. This highlights the nature of reality in his logical framework. It is composed of different combinations of objects and their relationships, which together form facts. These facts define what exists and constitute the world. Quote 7. A state of affairs, a state of things, is a combination of objects, things. This quote emphasizes that states of affairs, the building blocks of facts, are made up of objects and their specific arrangements. Objects themselves are fundamental, but it is their relationships with other objects that create meaningful facts or situations that we can comprehend within the world. Quote 8. Objects are simple. Wittgenstein asserts that objects, in their most basic form, cannot be broken down further. They are simple elements that cannot be divided into smaller components. These simple objects form the foundation of all states of affairs, and thus, they are critical to understanding the structure of reality. Quote 9. The totality of existing states of affairs is the world. This statement underscores that the world is composed of all the existing states of affairs, which are the combinations of objects. These states of affairs, when taken together, create the complete picture of the world, and anything that falls outside of these facts does not exist in the world. Quote 10. If I know an object, then I also know all the possibilities of its occurrence in states of affairs. This quote explains that knowing an object means understanding all the ways it can appear within different states of affairs. The possibilities are inherent in the object itself, and no new possibilities can emerge later. The object's potential for forming states of affairs is already determined. Quote 11. Each thing is, as it were, in a space of possible states of affairs. This space I can imagine empty, but I cannot imagine the thing without the space. Wittgenstein suggests that every object exists within a logical space, where it can combine with other objects to form states of affairs. While this space might not always be filled, it is impossible to imagine an object existing outside of this logical framework. Quote 12. Objects make up the substance of the world. That is why they cannot be composite. This statement emphasizes that objects, being the substance of the world, must be simple and indivisible. If objects were composite, the sense of the world would depend on more than just these fundamental elements. The substance of the world is made up of these simple, unchangeable objects. Quote 13. Objects, the unalterable and the subsistent, are one and the same. Wittgenstein asserts that objects are fundamental to reality. They are unchanging and provide the substance of the world. While their configurations may shift, creating different states of affairs, the objects themselves remain constant and unaltered, forming the enduring structure upon which reality is based. Quote 14. In the state of affairs, objects fit into one another like the links of a chain. This quote highlights the interconnected nature of objects within states of affairs. Objects are not isolated. They form meaningful relationships, much like links in a chain, where their configuration gives rise to facts. The specific way in which objects are related is what forms the structure of any given state of affairs. Quote 15. The existence and non-existence of states of affairs is reality. Wittgenstein defines reality as the sum of both existing and non-existing states of affairs. Reality is not limited to what is currently the case, but includes all possibilities of existence and non-existence. Positive facts are the states that exist, while negative facts are those that do not. Quote 16. We picture facts to ourselves. This quote explains that humans form mental representations or pictures of facts. These pictures, structured in a logical form, mirror the arrangement of objects in reality. Wittgenstein's theory of language as a reflection of the world begins with this idea that we grasp and communicate facts through pictorial forms. Quote 17. A picture is a model of reality. A picture, in Wittgenstein's sense, acts as a simplified representation of reality, structured in a way that allows it to depict states of affairs. The picture corresponds to real-world configurations of objects, making it a model that can either accurately or inaccurately reflect the actual state of things. Quote 18. What constitutes a picture is that its elements are related to one another in a determinate way. This statement underscores that the elements within a picture must have specific, structured relationships to one another. These relationships between elements mirror the way objects relate to each other in reality. The structure of the picture reflects the logical structure of the facts it depicts. Quote 19. Pictorial form is the possibility that things are related to one another in the same way as the elements of the picture. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the form of a picture is determined by the possibility of its elements corresponding to the real relationships between things. The picture's ability to depict reality lies in how its elements can mirror the connections found in the world. Quote 20. It is laid against reality like a measure. This metaphor illustrates how pictures serve as a tool for understanding reality. Just as a ruler is used to measure physical objects by aligning its scale with the object being measured, a picture aligns its elements with reality, allowing us to assess the truth or falsehood of the representation. Quote 21. If a fact is to be a picture, it must have something in common with what it depicts. Wittgenstein asserts that for a picture to represent reality, it must share a form or structure with the reality it depicts. This connection allows the picture to serve as a representation of the facts, ensuring that there is a commonality between the image and the world, which makes the depiction possible. Quote 22. What the picture must have in common with reality, in order to be able to represent it after its manner, rightly or falsely, is its form of representation. This emphasizes that the picture's ability to represent reality depends on the form it shares with the world. A picture can accurately or inaccurately represent reality, but the form of the picture must still correspond with the structure of the facts it aims to depict, allowing it to represent reality. Quote 23. What every picture, of whatever form, must have in common with reality in order to be able to represent it at all, rightly or falsely, is the logical form, that is, the form of reality. Wittgenstein underlines the necessity of logical form in any representation of reality. A picture must possess the logical structure of the reality it seeks to depict, which allows it to reflect or model the world, regardless of whether the depiction is accurate or not. Quote 24. A picture depicts reality by representing a possibility of existence and non-existence of states of affairs. Wittgenstein suggests that pictures can illustrate both the potential existence and non-existence of certain states of affairs. This means that a picture models not just what is, but also what could be, capturing a range of possible situations within logical space. Quote 25. What a picture represents, it represents independently of its truth or falsity, by means of its pictorial form. This statement explains that a picture's representation of reality is not dependent on its truth. The picture can still depict a scenario or a fact, whether or not it accurately reflects reality. The structure or form of the picture enables it to represent possible states of affairs, regardless of their actual truth. Quote 26. Thought can never be of anything illogical, since, if it were, we should have to think illogically. Wittgenstein emphasizes that thought is bound by logic. It is impossible to think of anything illogical because the very act of thinking requires coherence within the framework of logic. Any attempt to think illogically would break the very structure that allows for thought. Quote 27. It is as impossible to represent in language anything that contradicts logic as in geometry to represent by its coordinates a figure that contradicts the laws of space. This quote highlights the limits of representation, both in language and geometry. Just as a figure that defies the rules of geometry cannot be represented by coordinates, language cannot express anything that violates the principles of logic. Both systems are bound by their respective laws, and anything outside these laws is impossible to represent. Quote 28. A logical picture of facts is a thought. Wittgenstein establishes that thoughts are logical representations of facts. In this sense, thoughts act as models of reality, structured logically to depict the relationships between objects and states of affairs. This highlights the link between thinking and picturing the world. Quote 29. In a proposition, a thought finds an expression that can be perceived by the senses. This quote emphasizes that thoughts are communicated through propositions, which are expressed in a form that can be seen or heard, such as spoken or written language. A proposition acts as a projection of the thought, enabling others to grasp the meaning of the thought through sensory perception. Quote 30. What constitutes a propositional sign is that in it, its elements, the words, stand in a determinate relation to one another. A propositional sign is a fact. Wittgenstein points out that a propositional sign, like a sentence or statement, is not just a collection of words. It is a structured fact in which the elements, words, are arranged in a specific, meaningful way to reflect a state of affairs, similar to how facts are structured in the world. Quote 31. In a proposition, a name is representative of an object. This statement clarifies that within propositions, names serve as stand-ins or symbols for objects. When we use names in a sentence, we are referring to actual objects in the world, and propositions help describe how those objects relate to one another. Quote 32. A proposition has one and only one complete analysis. Wittgenstein asserts that every proposition has a specific, clear analysis, and this analysis reflects the precise structure of the thought it expresses. The idea here is that a proposition's meaning can be fully determined, leaving no ambiguity in how the proposition is understood. Quote 33. A name cannot be dissected any further by means of a definition. It is a primitive sign. Wittgenstein emphasizes that names are fundamental elements that cannot be broken down further into simpler components. They are primitive signs, meaning they directly refer to objects, and their meaning cannot be explained by definition beyond their association with the object they represent. Quote 34. Only propositions have sense. Only in the nexus of a proposition does a name have meaning. Wittgenstein explains that names only gain meaning within the context of a proposition. A name by itself does not convey meaning unless it is part of a structured proposition that expresses a fact or state of affairs. This highlights the importance of context for understanding meaning. Quote 35. An expression is the mark of a form and a content. This quote explains that an expression within a proposition denotes both the form and content of the proposition. The form refers to the logical structure of the proposition, while the content refers to the specific facts or states of affairs that the proposition describes. Quote 36. A sign is what can be perceived of a symbol. Wittgenstein explains that a sign is the physical manifestation of a symbol, something we can see or hear. However, signs are not the same as symbols. They are the outward forms through which symbols are expressed and perceived, conveying meaning based on their usage. Quote 37. In logical syntax, the meaning of a sign should never play a role. This statement emphasizes that the role of logical syntax is independent of the specific meanings of signs. Logical syntax operates at a structural level, focusing only on how signs are used within the rules of logic without reference to their particular meanings. Quote 38. A proposition possesses essential and accidental features. Wittgenstein differentiates between the necessary, essential aspects of a proposition, which give it meaning, and the accidental features, which are incidental to how the proposition is expressed. The essential features are what make the proposition meaningful, while the accidental ones are related to the way the proposition is physically produced. Quote 39. So what is essential in a proposition is what all propositions that can express the same sense have in common. This quote points to the idea that the core of a proposition lies in the shared aspects that allow different propositions to express the same sense. The essential part of a proposition is what remains consistent across various forms of expression, and this consistency is what gives it meaning. Quote 40. A proposition determines a place in logical space. Wittgenstein describes propositions as determining specific locations in logical space. The meaning of a proposition sets a particular logical framework, and the arrangement of its elements defines a unique position within this space, allowing it to fit within the overall structure of logical reality. Quote 41. The propositional sign with logical coordinates. That is the logical place. This quote highlights that the structure of a propositional sign determines its logical position. Each proposition has a specific place in logical space, defined by its internal arrangement, and this place reflects its logical relations with other propositions. Quote 42. The stipulation of values is the variable. Here, Wittgenstein explains that when we assign values to a propositional variable, we are defining its possible meanings. The variable becomes meaningful when specific propositions are linked to it, and these stipulations guide the interpretation of the variable. Quote 43. What signifies in a symbol is what is common to all the symbols that the rules of logical syntax allow us to substitute for it. Wittgenstein explains that the meaning of a symbol lies in its role within the logical system. A symbol's significance is determined by what it shares with other symbols, specifically, what can be substituted for it within the rules of logical syntax. This shared characteristic gives the symbol its place in the logical framework. Quote 44. A thought is a proposition with a sense. Wittgenstein begins Chapter 4 by defining a thought as a proposition that carries a sense, meaning that it expresses something understandable and communicable. A thought is not just an abstract idea, but a structured statement that conveys a specific meaning about reality. Quote 45. Most of the propositions and questions to be found in philosophical works are not false, but nonsensical. Wittgenstein argues that much of philosophy is misguided because it deals with propositions that fail to make sense rather than being outright false. These philosophical problems arise due to a misunderstanding of the logic behind language, leading to confusion and questions that cannot be answered. Quote 46. A proposition is a picture of reality. Wittgenstein asserts that a proposition functions as a picture, representing reality as we imagine it. Just as a picture depicts a scene, a proposition depicts a possible state of affairs, capturing how things could be or are in the world. Quote 47. Reality is compared with propositions. This quote emphasizes that propositions are tools we use to compare with reality, determining their truth or falsehood based on whether they accurately reflect the world. A proposition is meaningful only when we can relate it to the facts of the world and assess its correspondence with reality. Quote 48. A proposition can be true or false only in virtue of being a picture of reality. Wittgenstein explains that the truth or falsity of a proposition depends on its relationship with reality. A proposition can only be true or false if it serves as a picture of how things stand in the world, allowing us to evaluate whether it accurately reflects the state of affairs. Quote 49. A proposition must use old expressions to communicate a new sense. Wittgenstein notes that propositions are built using existing words or symbols, yet their meaning can be entirely new. This shows how language is capable of creating fresh meanings, even though it relies on familiar elements to communicate these ideas. Quote 50. In a proposition, there must be exactly as many distinguishable parts as in the situation that it represents. This statement explains that the structure of a proposition must mirror the structure of the reality it depicts. Each part of a situation must have a corresponding part in the proposition, ensuring that the logical complexity of both aligns. Quote 51. Every proposition must already have a sense. It cannot be given a sense by affirmation. Wittgenstein emphasizes that a proposition must inherently carry its own sense before any evaluation of its truth or falsity. Affirming or negating a proposition does not create its sense. The sense must be understood independently of these judgments. Quote 52. Propositions represent the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. Wittgenstein explains that propositions, the basic units of language, represent how things stand in the world. They either assert the existence or the non-existence of a state of affairs, meaning that propositions are fundamental to describing reality by showing what is or is not the case. Quote 53. Philosophy is not a body of doctrine, but an activity. Wittgenstein emphasizes that philosophy is not about creating a set of beliefs or truths, but about clarifying thoughts and propositions. Philosophy works to make vague or unclear ideas precise, functioning as a tool for logical clarification rather than a collection of philosophical statements. Quote 54. Propositions can represent the whole of reality, but they cannot represent what they must have in common with reality in order to be able to represent it. Logical form. Wittgenstein points out the limitation of propositions. While they can describe reality, they cannot capture the underlying logical form that makes this representation possible. Logical form is something that is shown by propositions, but cannot be directly stated or represented. Quote 55. Propositions show the logical form of reality. They display it. This statement highlights that while propositions cannot express logical form explicitly, they nonetheless reveal it through their structure. The arrangement of a proposition mirrors the logical structure of the reality it describes, showing the connection between language and the world. Quote 56. A property is internal if it is unthinkable that its object should not possess it. Wittgenstein defines an internal property as something that inherently belongs to an object, such as the relationship between lighter and darker shades of blue. These internal properties are essential and inseparable from the object itself, making them part of the object's identity. Quote 57. The propositional variable signifies the formal concept, and its values signify the objects that fall under the concept. Wittgenstein explains that a propositional variable, which can take on different values, represents a formal concept. The values that the variable takes correspond to the objects that fall under that concept, connecting abstract logical structures with actual objects. Quote 58. The sense of a proposition is its agreement and disagreement with possibilities of existence and non-existence of states of affairs. Wittgenstein states that the meaning of a proposition is determined by whether it aligns or conflicts with the possible existence of states of affairs. This shows how propositions derive their meaning by mapping out potential truths or falsehoods about reality. Quote 59. An elementary proposition consists of names. It is a nexus, a concatenation of names. Wittgenstein emphasizes that elementary propositions, which are the simplest form of propositions, are made up of names. These names stand for objects and are linked together to form a representation of a state of affairs, creating the basic structure of language. Quote 60. Truth possibilities of elementary propositions are the conditions of the truth and falsity of propositions. This quote explains that the truth or falsity of a proposition is determined by the truth possibilities of its elementary propositions. The arrangement of truth conditions for elementary propositions creates the foundation for understanding whether a proposition accurately reflects reality. Quote 61. The sign that results from correlating the mark T with truth possibilities is a propositional sign. Wittgenstein explains that when we associate a mark, such as T for truth, with various truth possibilities, the resulting sign is a propositional sign. This means that the structure of these signs allows us to represent the conditions under which a proposition can be true or false. Quote 62. Among the possible groups of truth conditions, there are two extreme cases. In one of these cases, the proposition is true for all the truth possibilities of the elementary propositions. We say that the truth conditions are tautological. In the second case, the proposition is false for all the truth possibilities. The truth conditions are contradictory. Here, Wittgenstein introduces tautologies and contradictions as extreme cases in logic. A tautology is always true, regardless of circumstances, while a contradiction is always false. Both lack any representational value because they do not reflect specific states of affairs. Quote 63. Propositions show what they say. Tautologies and contradictions show that they say nothing. Wittgenstein explains that ordinary propositions provide meaningful information about reality, while tautologies and contradictions fail to do so. A tautology, being true under all conditions, and a contradiction, being false under all conditions, do not describe any specific state of affairs and thus convey no real information. Quote 64. Tautology and contradiction are not pictures of reality. They do not represent any possible situations. This statement highlights that tautologies and contradictions are not representations of the world. A tautology allows for all possibilities, while a contradiction excludes all possibilities, leaving neither capable of depicting a specific reality or situation. Quote 65. The truth conditions of a proposition determine the range that it leaves open to the facts. Wittgenstein asserts that the truth conditions of a proposition define which facts can be considered as true or false within the framework of that proposition. In other words, propositions set boundaries for what facts are possible in a given logical structure. Quote 66. The general form of a proposition is, "This is how things stand." Wittgenstein concludes that the essence of any proposition is to declare how things are in the world. This general form captures the core function of propositions, which is to state whether certain states of affairs exist or do not exist, summarizing the representational purpose of language. Quote 67. A proposition is a truth function of elementary propositions. An elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. Wittgenstein explains that more complex propositions are built from elementary propositions, with their truth being a result of operations on these basic units. An elementary proposition, however, is self-contained, meaning its truth or falsity does not depend on anything other than itself. Quote 68. Truth functions can be arranged in series. That is the foundation of the theory of probability. This statement highlights that truth functions, which represent the logical relationships between propositions, can be ordered systematically. This ordering forms the basis for understanding probability, as it allows us to see how truth conditions influence one another and establish likelihoods. Quote 69. The structures of propositions stand in internal relations to one another. Wittgenstein asserts that the logical structures of propositions are not independent but interconnected. The internal relationships between propositions allow for logical operations and inferences, meaning that understanding one proposition can help in understanding another due to these intrinsic connections. Quote 70. When the truth of one proposition follows from the truth of others, we can see this from the structure of the propositions. This quote emphasizes that logical inference is not an external process, but something inherent in the structure of propositions themselves. When one proposition logically follows from another, this relationship is visible in the way the propositions are constructed and related to each other. Quote 71. There is no causal nexus to justify such an inference. Wittgenstein rejects the idea of a necessary causal connection between events that would allow us to infer one event from another. He argues that belief in such a causal connection is a superstition, and logical inferences do not require a causal link to be valid. Quote 72. If one proposition follows from another, then the latter says more than the former, and the former less than the latter. Wittgenstein explains that when one proposition follows from another, the second proposition contains more information or detail than the first. This relationship highlights the logical progression from simpler to more complex statements, where the complexity of meaning increases as we move from one proposition to the next. Quote 73. A proposition affirms every proposition that follows from it. This quote suggests that a proposition, by asserting its truth, also asserts the truth of any proposition that logically follows from it. The implications of a proposition extend beyond itself to all the logical consequences it entails. Quote 74. The freedom of the will consists in the impossibility of knowing actions that still lie in the future. Wittgenstein connects the concept of free will to the idea that future actions cannot be known with certainty. If causality were an inner necessity, like logical inference, we would be able to predict future actions with certainty. But because this is not possible, free will exists in this space of uncertainty. Quote 75. The operation is what has to be done to the one proposition in order to make the other out of it. Wittgenstein explains that an operation is the process that transforms one proposition into another. This transformation is based on the formal properties and internal structure of the propositions, illustrating how one logical form is derived from another. Quote 76. Truth functions of elementary propositions are results of operations with elementary propositions as bases. This statement emphasizes that truth functions, which represent logical operations, are built upon elementary propositions. These basic propositions serve as the foundation for more complex logical structures, and truth functions emerge as the result of applying logical operations to these foundations. Quote 77. An operation manifests itself in a variable. It shows how we can get from one form of proposition to another. Wittgenstein highlights that operations reveal themselves through variables, demonstrating how logical transformations occur. The variable expresses the difference between the forms of propositions, showing the underlying structure that allows one form to be derived from another. Quote 78. The occurrence of an operation does not characterize the sense of a proposition. This quote points out that the act of performing an operation does not contribute to the meaning of a proposition. Meaning is determined by the result of the operation, not the operation itself, and the sense of the proposition depends on the structure of its base. Quote 79. All propositions are results of truth operations on elementary propositions. Wittgenstein asserts that every proposition, no matter how complex, is ultimately the result of truth operations applied to elementary propositions. These basic building blocks, through successive operations, form the entirety of logical statements. Quote 80. Truth functions are not material functions. This statement clarifies that truth functions do not operate on physical or material objects, but on logical propositions. For example, double negation, P, does not negate an object, but reverses the sense of a proposition, showing that logical operations are abstract rather than tied to physical entities. Quote 81. If we introduced logical signs properly, then we should also have introduced at the same time the sense of all combinations of them. Wittgenstein explains that when logical signs are introduced, their combinations and the effects of those combinations should also be made clear. This approach ensures that the meaning of all possible configurations of logical signs is understood from the outset. Quote 82. Signs for logical operations are punctuation marks. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the signs used to represent logical operations, such as brackets and logical symbols, are akin to punctuation marks. They help structure propositions and indicate relationships, but do not carry independent meaning outside their role in organizing the logical content. Quote 83. An elementary proposition really contains all logical operations in itself. Wittgenstein asserts that even the simplest proposition inherently includes all the logical operations that could apply to it. The structure of an elementary proposition is such that it reflects the general form of all propositions, embodying the full range of logical possibilities. Quote 84. The general propositional form is the essence of a proposition. This statement emphasizes that the underlying structure of a proposition, its general form, defines its essence. Every proposition shares this basic form, and it is through this form that propositions can express logical relationships and states of affairs. Quote 85. We cannot give a sign the wrong sense. This quote reinforces the idea that the meaning of a sign in logic is determined by its proper usage within the logical system. It is impossible to assign an incorrect meaning to a sign because the logical framework ensures that every sign has a specific role and sense. Quote 86. Every truth function is a result of successive applications to elementary propositions of the operation. Wittgenstein explains that all truth functions, or logical operations, derive from the application of certain operations to elementary propositions. These operations negate or affirm the propositions, building more complex logical structures from basic components. Quote 87. Identity of object I express by identity of sign, and not by using a sign for identity. Wittgenstein clarifies that identity is not a relation between objects that needs a special sign. Instead, the identity of an object is shown by using the same sign for that object. When different signs are used, they indicate different objects. Quote 88. What the axiom of infinity is intended to say would express itself in language through the existence of infinitely many names with different meanings. Wittgenstein suggests that the axiom of infinity, which posits the existence of an infinite number of objects, would naturally manifest in language if there were infinitely many distinct names. The language would reflect this infinity by generating new symbols as needed. Quote 89. In the general propositional form, propositions occur in other propositions only as bases of truth operations. Wittgenstein explains that propositions can only appear within other propositions as part of logical operations, such as negation or conjunction. They do not represent objects or entities themselves, but serve as components in the manipulation of truth values, highlighting the operational nature of logic. Quote 90. The experience that we need in order to understand logic is not that something or other is the state of things, but that something is. That, however, is not an experience. Wittgenstein asserts that logic is independent of any specific content or state of affairs. Understanding logic does not come from observing particular things in the world, but from grasping the fact that certain conditions exist, which is a logical understanding, not an empirical experience. Quote 91. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. This famous quote expresses the idea that the boundaries of what we can think and understand are defined by the structure of our language. What we cannot express in language is beyond our conceptual world, making language the framework through which we interpret reality. Quote 92. We cannot think what we cannot think. So what we cannot think, we cannot say either. Wittgenstein emphasizes the limitation of thought and language. If something is beyond the scope of our thought, it is also beyond our capacity to articulate. This underscores the interdependence of thinking and speaking, suggesting that both are confined by the same logical boundaries. Quote 93. I am my world, the microcosm. Wittgenstein describes a personal perspective on reality, where the self is not separate from the world, but is instead the framework through which the world is understood. This view aligns with solipsism, suggesting that one's subjective experience defines the boundaries of their world. Quote 94. The subject does not belong to the world. Rather, it is a limit of the world. Wittgenstein argues that the self, or the subject, is not part of the physical world, but is the boundary of it. The subject serves as the lens through which the world is perceived, and in this sense, it defines the limits of one's reality rather than existing as an object within it. Quote 95. Here it can be seen that solipsism, when its implications are followed out strictly, coincides with pure realism. The self of solipsism shrinks to a point without extension, and there remains the reality coordinated with it. Wittgenstein concludes that solipsism, the idea that only one's own mind is certain to exist, leads to the same conclusion as realism. As solipsism is pushed to its logical extreme, the self becomes insignificant, leaving only the reality that it perceives, thus aligning with the concept of a shared external world. Quote 96. The general form of a truth function is pn sex. This is the general form of a proposition. Wittgenstein introduces the idea that every proposition is a truth function, derived from elementary propositions through successive logical operations. This general form applies to all propositions, regardless of complexity, illustrating how they can be systematically generated. Quote 97. The propositions of logic are tautologies. This statement underlines that logical propositions are tautologies, meaning they are always true regardless of the specific facts they describe. These tautologies reveal the formal properties of language and logic, but they do not provide any new information about the world. Quote 98. Logic is not a body of doctrine, but a mirror image of the world. Logic is transcendental. Wittgenstein suggests that logic does not consist of factual knowledge, but instead reflects the structure of the world. It is transcendental because it defines the framework within which any possible thought or proposition must exist without being part of the empirical world itself. Quote 99. The fact that the propositions of logic are tautologies shows the formal, logical, properties of language and the world. Here, Wittgenstein explains that the tautological nature of logical propositions reveals the underlying structure of both language and the world. The way propositions are combined to form tautologies reflects the logic inherent in the relationships between things. Quote 100. It is the peculiar mark of logical propositions that one can recognize that they are true from the symbol alone. Wittgenstein highlights the unique nature of logical propositions. Their truth is evident simply from their symbolic form. Unlike factual propositions, whose truth must be verified against reality, logical propositions are self-evident by their structure. Quote 101. Logic must look after itself. If a sign is possible, then it is also capable of signifying. Wittgenstein argues that logic is self-sufficient, meaning that any sign that can exist within the system of logic must also have meaning within that system. This reflects the self-regulating nature of logical structures, where only meaningful signs can be part of the system. Quote 102. One can calculate whether a proposition belongs to logic by calculating the logical properties of the symbol. Wittgenstein emphasizes that determining whether a proposition is part of logic involves analyzing the symbols used. The proof of a logical proposition comes from manipulating these symbols, showing how further tautologies arise from initial ones, demonstrating that the process and result in logic are equivalent. Quote 103. Every tautology itself shows that it is a tautology. Wittgenstein explains that tautologies, propositions that are always true, demonstrate their nature through their structure. There is no need for further proof or derivation, as each tautology reveals its truth simply by existing within logical form, highlighting the self-evident nature of logical truth. Quote 104. Mathematics is a logical method. The propositions of mathematics are equations, and therefore pseudo-propositions. This statement explains that mathematics is a form of logic, but the equations it produces are not true propositions. Rather, they represent relationships between symbols, making them pseudo-propositions that do not express thoughts or describe the world directly. Quote 105. If two expressions are combined by means of the sign of equality, that means that they can be substituted for one another. Wittgenstein points out that the equality sign in mathematics indicates that two expressions are interchangeable. This substitutability defines their logical form, making the relationship between them evident from the expressions themselves, without needing further explanation. Quote 106. The process of calculating serves to bring about that intuition. Calculation is not an experiment. Wittgenstein highlights that mathematical calculation is not a form of empirical investigation, but rather a method of revealing the logical structure within numbers and equations. Through calculation, the necessary relations in mathematics become clear, without the need for external verification. Quote 107. The exploration of logic means the exploration of everything that is subject to law, and outside logic, everything is accidental. This quote illustrates Wittgenstein's view that logic governs all that can be systematically known or reasoned about. Outside of this framework, anything that happens is purely contingent or accidental, as it lies beyond the realm of logical necessity. Quote 108. The law of causality is not a law, but the form of a law. Wittgenstein explains that causality is not a fundamental principle in itself, but rather a framework within which laws of nature are expressed. This shifts the focus from causality as an ultimate explanation to seeing it as a structural pattern for describing relationships between events. Quote 109. Mechanics is an attempt to construct, according to a single plan, all the true propositions that we need for the description of the world. This statement describes mechanics as a method of organizing the true propositions of physics in a coherent, unified way. It provides the building blocks for describing the world, ensuring that all physical laws and phenomena can be expressed within its structured system. Quote 110. The procedure of induction consists in accepting as true the simplest law that can be reconciled with our experience. This quote emphasizes that induction, the process of generalizing from observations, relies on choosing the simplest explanation that fits the data. However, Wittgenstein highlights the lack of logical justification for this method, acknowledging its psychological appeal rather than a guarantee of truth. Quote 111. There is no compulsion making one thing happen because another has happened. The only necessity that exists is logical necessity. Wittgenstein states that events in the world are not determined by an inevitable causal chain, but by logical relationships. The only true form of necessity is found in logic, not in the physical or causal world, challenging traditional views of causality. Quote 112. The world of the happy man is a different one from that of the unhappy man. This quote suggests that a person's perspective and emotional state profoundly shape their perception of the world. The same external world appears fundamentally different to someone who is happy compared to someone who is unhappy, reflecting the subjective nature of experience. Quote 113. Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. Wittgenstein points out that death is outside the realm of experience because it signifies the end of consciousness. Life continues within the framework of experience, while death is something that happens beyond it, making it impossible to experience or describe from within life. Quote 114. If a question can be framed at all, it is also possible to answer it. Wittgenstein asserts that meaningful questions inherently contain the possibility of an answer. If something can be articulated clearly as a question, it can also be resolved, as the act of framing it logically implies a path to its solution. Quote 115. We feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. Wittgenstein expresses that scientific inquiry cannot address the deeper existential questions of life. Even after science has provided all its answers, the profound questions about meaning, purpose, and existence persist, indicating the limitations of scientific explanations in resolving life's mysteries. Quote 116. There are, indeed, things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. Wittgenstein concludes that some aspects of reality, those that are deeply significant or mystical, cannot be expressed in language. These truths reveal themselves in ways beyond words, highlighting the limits of language in capturing the entirety of human experience. Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Ludwig Wittgenstein leaves readers with a radical view of language and its philosophical limitations, culminating in the idea that what lies beyond language must be left in silence. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the essence of reality and logic cannot be fully articulated through propositions. Instead, they are shown in the structure and function of language itself. By guiding readers through a philosophical ascent, only to urge them to discard the very propositions that aided in this understanding, Wittgenstein invites a contemplative stance on the ineffable aspects of existence. His work concludes with an invitation to transcend the limitations of language, viewing philosophy not as a source of answers, but as a guide to clarity.
Curious to dive into the mind of Ludwig Wittgenstein? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.